Well, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Worship Perspectives. This week, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to fire into a remote interview session. We're going to try to start doing more of these to try to incorporate more people into the Worship Perspectives team. Um, it can get kind of difficult to get people in person, so we're going to try to do some remote sessions. So, this is going to be the first. This is Josh. Y'all may remember him from a previous episode. He's going to be doing some remote sessions with us while he's in school. So this is going to be some lessons learned. Feel free to give us some comments. We're going to call this episode "What in the Flood." So the all humor aside, this one's about the biblical flood. We're going to take it beyond the biblical flood a little bit, and we're going to talk about cultural outside of the Bible, some things. But before I dive into all that, with no further ado, I'm going to bring Josh in. We're going to add him real quick. Bear with me just a second. And we're going to fire him up. Josh, say hey to everybody.
What's going on, everybody?
Okay, they can't answer you back, just so you know. No, I'm just playing. We try to keep
They
this
can answer
humorous
in
and
the
light.
comments.
Yeah, we definitely want to start live streaming here in the near future. We're trying to get our viewership up a little before we do that, but we may do it sooner rather than later. And hopefully that'll give us live feedback for the time being. Just leave comments on Facebook, YouTube as you watch, and on the podcast if you listen there. So with no further ado on that, we're going to introduce the episode officially, and we're going to start with the win on this. And Josh is in school for ministry, and I'm going to be leaning heavily on this. I'm going to drive it, and Rob's going to join in and chime in. We were just talking about this beforehand, but Josh, when do you, based on your research, believe that the biblical flood actually occurred in history?
So, there are many, many different, interpretations of, how old is the earth? How old is the universe? You get into young earth theory, you get into old earth theory. So based off the research I've done, based off of the research of people that are way smarter than I am, one of the projects that I lean kind of heavily on when you do research about, early beginnings, especially in the book of Genesis, is the website is called answeringgenesis.org. And it's, some really, really smart people that love to get together. And they really talk about, the beginning, things that we see in the Bible. And so, according to their research, this is not my research, this is their research that they've done. From what I've seen, it's really accurate. It looks like it's really solid stuff. They estimate that the flood happened somewhere around 2300 BC. Um, and so, if you're familiar with the story of the flood, you know that it's when God saw the wickedness of man, and he used Noah, who is described in later on in Peter's writings as a man who, was preaching righteousness. Noah was within favor of God, and so God used Noah and his family, and he shuts them into the ark. The earth floods. It rains for 40 days and 40 nights. They're on the water for several months as the waters start to subside, and then the story of how he sent the dove out multiple times trying to find dry land, and finally the dove comes back with the olive branch or the branch, and they find land, the waters subside, and then we see basically the rebirth of humanity after the flood. So that's kind of the overall nutshell of what the flood is, kind of when it happened, the high points of what happened. I can give more detail in certain areas if you want, but that's just kind of the big overarching viewpoint and details of it.
Now let's kind of unpack that one at a time rather than digging into
Okay.
everything. You mentioned the rebirth of humanity. That's a good segue because that's going
Right.
to be the next question I have is how did humanity repopulate, and how is that explained when you bring in like Native Americans, Inuit, Canadian, original?
Right. Okay. So, explaining, with the rebirth of humanity and where different, people groups came from, that is an awesome question that I do not have an answer to, but I will give you kind of my thought process on it. So, after we see the floodwaters subside and Noah and his family get out of the ark, Genesis chapter 9 is kind of where that picks up. Um, And so towards the end of Genesis chapter 8 into Genesis chapter 9, so Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, it says, "And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hands they are delivered." So to me, right there, that gives us the understanding that Noah and his family were to repopulate the earth. They're to be fruitful and multiply. Now, if we move on a little bit further into Genesis, we see the nations descend from Noah in chapter 10. And that goes out, and you see of Noah's children and how they have moved on from where they came. And it gets into the sons of Ham and where they went. And then you see just to Shalem, who's another son of Noah, and how where his offsprings go. So to me, as you know, my thought process through this, you see the movement of Noah's sons and their offsprings into different parts of the um, earth after the floodwaters have subsided. Um, to get a little bit more specific, if you look in Genesis chapter 11, that is the story of the Tower of Babel. Now, that story is where we see different languages come about. So Genesis 11:1 says, "Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land and settled there. And they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly.'" So they start making stones and all that. And we come through and we see in verse 6, "And the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to um, do with now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. So that to me, in those three chapters, as we walk through Genesis, that's how we kind of get, different ethnic groups, different languages. That's how we get the spreading of humanity. Is once again, you see uh, the whole reason why the languages were separated was, as it says in Genesis 11, chapter 4, "Then they said," this being the people that are there, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower which its tops in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." So once again, you see the sinfulness of man, and God has to come in and punish the sinfulness of man, and to keep man from trying to once again be its own God, he disperses them and gives them all different languages.
That's a fair point, and this is where I have trouble because I hear so many conversations about the evolution of man and man having existed for millions of years and going through Cro-Magnon,
Hmm.
Homo sapiens, Homo sapien sapien.
Hmm.
Um, and this is where I struggle because I hear conversations of millions of years, and I read the Bible, and I'm like, that just doesn't line up to me. It doesn't. And to
Right.
me, the flood is a natural way to explain that because a flood would have easily redeposited fossils. It would
Hmm.
have moved
Hmm.
Earth literally.
Hmm.
A lot of people
I
would
mean,
just
if we're talking, let's say, if we're talking about a flood of this massive proportion, that's how the Grand Canyon was formed. It was not over millions of years of erosion. If you have that much
yeah.
water and that much movement, that's how you get something that massive
And then you've
the
got
way it
huge
is.
jagged boulders that are going through this, just carving through everything it
Yeah,
touches.
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, so that's where I struggle heavily when I hear these conversations about
Yeah.
millions of years, Mesozoic, prehistoric.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
man's
I uh,
pride
I
trying to
definitely would
blend it.
not. Yeah,
Yep, go ahead.
yeah, I would definitely not categorize myself as someone who is a old Earth theorist, or I would very much put myself in the new Earth camp of Earth not being billions of years old.
But then there's also
I think the
conversations that
estimate.
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just saying. Then there's also conversations that get brought in, and I'm not going to dig into this one because it's a future episode. I was talking with one of our staff here at the church about the Nephilim or Nephilim, however you say it, the sons of
Hmm.
angels, sons of whatever, um,
Hmm.
gray areas there. So without digging into the specifics of that, to me, that's where I kind of struggle a little bit. And this is a perfect example of the gray areas of the Bible because while I might not believe in the millions of years theories, I definitely believe that there could be pockets of tens of thousands of years that are unaccounted for with creatures
Hmm.
like the Nephilim, and things like
Hmm.
that. So when people say, "So you believe the Earth is only 2,000 years old or 25?" I'm like, "No, I don't believe that. I'm saying to say that it's 64 million years and that things have existed for billions of
Hmm.
years is too far of a stretch for me."
Hmm.
So,
Mhm.
but
Yeah, no, I
recentering
definitely
the
agree with that.
conversation back on the flood to me, I'm not a historian where I can tell you the Chinese believe this, the Middle East believes this,
Hmm.
but I know enough to know that there are
Right,
records of flood events throughout the world. So I'm curious your take on those.
right. And I mean, there's, I mean, we see floods, I mean, here in the United States all the time, whether it be from hurricanes or, I mean, you see the floods that are happening in California right now from the massive snowstorms they've had in the northern parts of the state. As that snow has melted and it runs down these, small creeks and rivers in California, and, it floods, and there's erosion that takes place with these floods. There's natural events that take place when that much water goes into a place that quickly with that kind of speed. Um, and so, I mean, there has been, historical accounts of flooding all across. I mean, one of the greatest examples that you see of flooding is with the ancient Egyptians in the Nile River. The Nile River would flow over its banks. It would deposit the minerals into the the banks of the river, and that's how Egypt was born. It was, that's why Egypt's always called, it's birthed out of the Nile River because water was the life of that area there because it's such a dry and desolate area. But when you have that much water bringing all the nutrients that it brings from the depths, and it would overflow, and that's how things were built. So I mean, there's good things that come out of the floods, but there's also death and destruction that you see from whether it be floods such as snow melting, massive amounts of rain, or even like what we saw is it 2013 or 14 in Japan with the tsunami that hit
Oh yeah.
that portion and flooded that nuclear power plant and that coastal fishing village that was almost wiped off the map due to flooding. So um, you know we see it a lot.
Yeah, and when I have people talk to me, doesn't happen a lot, but when they talk about things like the flood, the biblical flood, they're like, "So you're telling me
Mhm.
you believe that a God just reached down and literally flooded the earth to the point where everything was covered?" I'm like, "No, I believe the God who created the earth can very
Mhm.
easily reach
Mhm.
down and do what he wants with the earth." And
Yeah,
when you
you're
see
about
the
to say,
power,
yeah,
like you said, of a
yeah.
tsunami that can literally wipe a city off in a matter of minutes,
Mhm.
that's not hard to
Mhm.
believe for me. But
Or even look at any evidence
No,
of a flood anywhere in the world that we've seen. It changes the landscape.
yeah,
yeah. I
An
mean,
area is
it
never the
in
same
some
after a flood.
places, yeah. No, I mean, in some places, it dramatically changes the landscape. Like you'll have people to come back in and will not recognize where their house used to be because it's so dramatically changed.
and I use Hurricane Katrina as a good example, and this is not to compare to the biblical
That
flood.
that would be that would be probably for most people that know that story. That would be probably the closest thing you could get to people understanding what the biblical flood looked like, just because of the sheer just devastation that was
Magnitude of it.
caused by Katrina. Yeah.
Well, and the it was the first time in my life. I'm not saying it hasn't happened before. I know it has, where an instance of a hurricane came in and it wasn't just blowing and blowing storm surge. It was
Hmm.
pulling water out of lakes. It was, I mean, it literally water
Yeah.
was coming from every direction
Yeah.
into an area that
Yeah.
man built because man believes that we are indestructible, and we
Hmm.
build in areas we
I mean,
shouldn't build, and then
yeah.
you know.
I mean, Katrina showed the non-superiority of man to God and nature. I mean, the levees when the levees broke there in New Orleans, that was it. I mean, that was the last line of defense for water, and you could just see how quickly, even with one of those, when one of those levees broke, that much water being pushed on the other ones caused them all to fail. And I mean, you could just see the power of what water can do um, in that instance.
Yeah, and I've heard some numbers a couple of times, and forgive me, I don't know them off the top of my head, but it was something like 7% of the land that is available on the earth actually exposed above water. So you imagine
Hmm.
just the magnitude of water that it covers the other
Hmm.
93% or whatever that number would be.
Yeah.
There has to have been Earth scale events that have happened to reshape that.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Hmm.
well,
Exactly.
yeah, that's the crux of this conversation. We're gonna have many more like it, but I guess in a nutshell, what I would like to hear is what do you think happened post flood? The biblical perspective of the flood is pretty clear of why God did it, what He did. The
Hmm.
wind we figured out pretty close, whatever. But after the flood, what do you think happened to mankind? Did Noah's ancestors go and fill the earth, or did Noah's ancestors or siblings or whatever, did they populate where they were, and then throughout history people have wandered into the other parts of the earth?
Hmm.
What do you think?
Um, I think it's a yes and no to both of the possibilities. I mean, I kind of jumped ahead a little bit when I was explaining the different people groups and everything into Genesis, talking about, the Tower of Babel and then being dispersed. I think at first, you see the desire of humanity to be in an area that is, you know, familiar to them. At first they tried to stay, in the area that they originally were before they started slowly moving. And then you see the battle lines or the societal lines kind of being drawn once something gets changed between you and another person. And so you really start to see that aspect of humanity come out when the language is changed in Genesis 11. You really see mankind, you know, no longer being able to put the differences aside because they can't understand each other. And so they go off with the people that they can understand, and they go off, as far as they can. They disperse. Genesis 11:9 says that, the Lord dispersed them all over the face of the earth. Um, and so my, thought process and opinion of it would be is that at first, they wanted to stay within the area of where the ark had landed. But, you know, natural, the curiosity of what lies outward, and then, not being having a oneness with the people that you're around causes you to move into, an area of somewhat familiarity. I mean, you see it in today. We want to live in communities with people that are like us. You don't want to move into a community with people that are not like you. It takes time to get adjusted to that if you do it. You see when missionaries go across and get into these new cultures, the first thing that they do is they learn about the culture they're going to be in, so they know how to engage with the people that they're going to be witnessing to. Because it's really difficult for me to come in as an American and to go to some lost tribe that I don't understand how they communicate with each other, what their cultural do's and don'ts are, and I just come in and try and just blast them with my thought process.
Yeah.
One of the ways that, I mean, we saw Jesus do this. Jesus sat and ate and had fellowship with people that were not like him. He sat and ate with people that were seen as outcast, as the least of these. He sat with those people and he got to know them as he did his earthly ministry. And if we're called to be, followers of Christ and to be, like Christ, we have to take his example of how to interact and spend time with people.
Yeah, for sure. And that brings up an interesting analog. It's not flood related, but you mentioned it yourself that people, they're one of two camps. They either want to stay with the people that are comfortable with, call it complacency, call it whatever you want to do. And
Hmm.
then there's the other group that wants to be unique and wants to carve their own path. And I see an analog in that when I look at the United States today, when you see conservatism and liberalism, where
Hmm.
people are just to the point now where we had common threads before, but now it's the first time in history that it feels like there are things we're not going to get past with each other. And what you're
Right. Now,
seeing is
completely agree with that.
people are starting to move into these red state, blue state, liberal, conservative
Hmm.
areas. and saying, you know
I mean,
what, we just
I mean,
can't
you've
live in that.
seen, yeah. I think one of the biggest indicators to that was the 2020 census, and you seeing the population movement from these larger liberal states like California and New York and Michigan into states like Texas and Florida and North Carolina and even like Iowa and Tennessee, states like that that are growing with people because, people want to be around ideas that are they not only believe with, but ideas that, can help them in the long run of what they're wanting to do. And so I think that's another thing that we see, all the way back at the beginning of humanity is that, we're not really very different from the first people that were on Earth. We have the same tendencies that they did. We may
Yeah,
have more stuff, and our stuff may be cooler when it comes to technology and stuff, but,
it's the same fundamental
at
problem.
the end of the day, we still have the same fundamental problem. It's that we're in need of a savior.
Yeah.
Um,
And that was kind of where I was going with that. The analog being that in my mind's eye, I go back to like ancient Greece, ancient Egyptian times, and I see these instances. We don't have a lot of record of it, but where people split off and did their own thing and they went and formed their own little country or their own little area. And they had this nice little perfect world until they didn't when they started birthing
mhm,
their generations and they started realizing, okay, we're getting different again. And then the fall of the Roman Empire could probably be attributed largely to people. They just grew to a point where there was too many of them that believed differently and their government no
mhm,
longer worked. And I see these analogs. I'm like,
right,
we're living the same thing. The only difference is we're only 200 plus years old as a country,
mhm,
whereas they were
mhm,
thousands of years old. So people are like, well, the U.S. was the perfect country. No, it never was. It was just the best thing available when it was formed. So now we have to learn the same
mhm.
lessons that we learned 10,000 years ago or however many.
Yeah, exactly. It's the old saying that, they say to all of people that study history, if you don't study and learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it.
Well, and
Um,
the irony in that
and
is you're going to repeat it either way, but it's
right,
a
it
different.
just, yeah,
Well, that's cool, man. I know it's getting late. We're going to try to wrap this one up. We're going to try to dig in deeper on some of these other episodes. This was kind of a get our feet wet episode. We
yeah,
already produced another one tonight too, but we'll do a deep dive on another one
yeah,
next week or as soon as we can get to it. But I appreciate you taking time out of your week, man, and look forward to more of
yeah.
these.
Of course, I enjoy it. Yeah,
Helpful thoughts and enjoyed it, man. I hope you have a blessed week.
Thanks, Josh. It's great to see you.
good to see you too, guys.